There are cities that grew slowly, following the patient logic of trade routes and river crossings, accumulating their histories the way soil accumulates upon a forest floor, layer by quiet layer, year by imperceptible year. And then there is Philadelphia. Philadelphia arrived in the world not gradually but fully conceived, laid out in the mind of William Penn before a single street had been trodden, before a single brick had been mortared, before the ancient forest had yielded even a single acre to the axe. By the time the century that is our subject commenced, this city had already witnessed the signing of the Declaration of Independence within its limits, had already served as capital of a new nation, and had already grown into the most populous and consequential city in the American Republic. And yet, despite the weight of those great events, the majority of its inhabitants lived in the same quiet registers as people everywhere, rising before dawn to tend to trades and households, navigating streets that were often uneven and sometimes impassable, raising children in the shadow of history without themselves feeling particularly historical. Welcome to the American Gazetteer. Tonight, we turn the pages of history back to Philadelphia County, Pennsylvania, the birthplace of a nation, as it endured and flourished and transformed across the whole long arc of that remarkable century. Philadelphia County occupied the southeastern corner of Pennsylvania, its boundaries shaped by the twin rivers that had determined the city's location from the beginning. The Delaware River formed the county's eastern edge, broad and tidal, and brown with the sediment of its long journey from the highlands of New York. The Schuylkill, smaller but no less consequential, traced the western boundary of William Penn's original city grid, before continuing its own course to join the Delaware below the town. Between these two watercourses, and spreading northward and westward beyond their immediate banks, lay a county of extraordinary density, complexity, and historical significance. The Delaware was the county's great commercial artery. Its wharves received vessels from every maritime nation, disgorging textiles from Manchester, molasses from the West Indies, timber from the Baltic, and the miscellaneous goods of global commerce. The wharves extended along the city's eastern face in an unbroken succession of planked platforms, warehouses, and counting houses, the air above them perpetually scented with salt water, rope tar, coal smoke, and the particular pungency of damp grain. Families such as the Whartons, the Biddles, and the Morses conducted commerce along these wharves that connected Philadelphia not merely to the nation, but to the wider trading world, their counting house ledgers recording transactions that reached to Calcutta and Canton. The Schuylkill served a different but equally vital purpose. Where the Delaware connected Philadelphia to the world, the Schuylkill connected it to the interior of Pennsylvania. The Schuylkill navigation system, completed through a series of canals and slackwater pools by 1825, allowed boats laden with anthracite coal from the mountains of Schuylkill County to reach Philadelphia, transforming both the fuel supply of the city and the economic geography of the state. The river's banks within the county were lined, by mid-century, with mills and manufactories that consumed its water power with remorseless efficiency, the wheel and the spindle replacing the quiet meadows that had once sloped to its margins. Philadelphia County contained, in addition to the city proper, a constellation of townships, boroughs, and districts that were legally distinct entities until the Great Consolidation of 1854. These included Germantown, Kensington, Northern Liberties, Southwark, Moyamensing, Passyunk, Blockley, Roxborough, Bristol Township, Byberry Township, Oxford Township, Frankford, and others whose names mapped the gradual spread of settlement outward from Penn's original 2-square-mile grid. Each of these communities possessed its own character, its own population mix, its own dominant industries, and its own history of arrival and development. The soil of the county varied from the alluvial bottomlands along the rivers, rich, dark, and prone to seasonal flooding, to the lighter sandy soils of the uplands and the heavier clay of the western portions. In the northern townships, where settlement remained somewhat less dense through the earlier decades, farms of considerable productivity raised wheat, corn, and hay, their harvests contributing to the vast provisioning trade that made Philadelphia one of the great granary cities of the Atlantic world. The Norris, the Logan, and the Pemberton families had established country seats and substantial landholdings in these northern reaches, their estates blending agricultural productivity with the aesthetic pleasures of landscape gardening. The Wissahickon Creek deserved particular mention among the county's smaller waterways. Rising in Montgomery County to the north, it entered Philadelphia County and descended through a rocky, wooded gorge of considerable natural beauty before joining the Schuylkill near the village of Roxborough. The creek's banks were colonized by mills from an early period, paper mills, grist mills, and various other enterprises exploiting its swift and reliable current. The Rittenhouse family, whose ancestors had established the first paper mill in colonial America along the Wissahickon in the 17th century, left their name upon the landscape in ways that persisted throughout the century and beyond. The Pennapack Creek traced its course through the county's northeastern townships, its valley rather gentler than the Wissahickon's dramatic gorge. The Pennapack had been the site of mills and small settlements from the earliest period of European colonization, and the communities along its banks, Byberry, Moreland, and the scattered farms of Bristol Township, maintained an agricultural character longer than many other parts of the county, their fields and orchards persisting even as the areas closer to the city were absorbed into urban uses. The population of the county grew with a rapidity that was remarkable even by the expansive standards of the era. Records suggest approximately 81,000 souls in the county at the opening of the century, a figure that more than doubled to over 400,000 by 1850, and then surpassed 1 million by 1890. This growth reflected immigration from Ireland, Germany, England, and eventually Southern and Eastern Europe, as well as migration from the American South and the rural regions of Pennsylvania itself. At the century's commencement, Philadelphia still carried the prestige of having served as the nation's capital, though that distinction had recently passed to the new city being constructed on the Potomac. The memory of the Constitutional Convention, of the great debates and deliberations that had taken place within Independence Hall, lingered in the very atmosphere of the city's streets. The building itself, then still called the State House, stood as a brick reminder that the Republic had been conceived within these particular precincts, a weight of historical significance that shaped how the city understood itself and how it was understood by those who came to it from elsewhere. William Penn had imagined his city as a green country town, spacious, orderly, its residents dwelling in houses set back from the street amid gardens that would prevent the catastrophic fires and epidemic diseases that had ravaged London. The reality of Philadelphia in the early decades of the century was something considerably less sylvan. The grid of streets had been laid out faithfully, the numbered streets running north and south between the Delaware and Schuylkill, the named streets, Market, Chestnut, Walnut, Spruce, Pine, running east and west. Yet the spaces Penn had imagined, as gardens had long been built upon, and the streets were crowded with the evidence of a city that had outgrown its founder's vision while remaining faithful to his geometry. The streets of the city were, for most of the early century, unpaved or poorly paved. Rain transformed them into rivers of mud, and drought raised clouds of choking dust. The paving of streets in cobblestone or Belgian block proceeded gradually from the commercial center outward, a project that occupied municipal attention and resources across the entire period. The sounds of the streets were distinctive and memorable to those who recorded their impressions. The clatter of iron-rimmed wheels on stone, the cries of street vendors announcing their wares, the tolling of church bells that marked the hours and called the faithful, and beneath it all, the constant murmur of the city's enormous population conducting the business of daily existence. The houses of the city reflected its social geography with considerable fidelity. The finest dwellings, substantial 3- and 4-story brick structures with marble stoops, paneled doors, and fanlights above the entries, occupied the more fashionable addresses near Washington Square and along Chestnut Street. The Biddle family maintained an elegant townhouse whose appointments spoke of both wealth and cultivation. The Wistar family, the Ingersoll family, and the Fisher family similarly inhabited residences that combined comfort with the architectural propriety expected of Philadelphia's mercantile elite. Behind and between these handsome streets lay a different world, the courts, alleys, and narrow passages, where the laboring population resided in conditions considerably less spacious and considerably less salubrious. These crowded byways, bearing names such as Bread Street, Apple Tree Alley, and Nanny Goat Market, housed the weavers, laborers, domestic servants, and tradespeople whose labor sustained the city's prosperity. Their dwellings were modest at best, 2-room brick structures of 2 stories, their walls thin against winter cold, their cellars prone to flooding and often inhabited by additional families. The markets were among the most vivid features of the city's daily life. The High Street Market, occupying the central strip of what was also called Market Street, had been a feature of Philadelphia since Penn's earliest plans, and it drew vendors and buyers from throughout the county and beyond. On market days, which occurred twice weekly, farmers from the northern townships arrived in their wagons before dawn, their loads including vegetables, fruit, dairy products, poultry, and prepared foods. The stalls extended for many blocks, their vendors competing with voices and signs for the attention of housewives, cooks, and hotel buyers. The market was a social institution as well as an economic one. News was exchanged as readily as coin, and the particular mixture of urban and rural, wealthy and modest, established families and recent arrivals created a democratic tableau that few other institutions could match. The Rush family's cook was as likely to be found at the same butter stall as the housewife from Germantown, their purposes identical, even if their circumstances differed enormously. Water supply was a matter of perpetual civic concern. The Fairmount Water Works, designed by Frederick Graff and completed in its principal form during the 18-teens, was one of the engineering wonders of early American civilization. A dam across the Schuylkill created the reflecting pool that became one of the most celebrated landscapes in the Republic, and steam-powered and later water-powered pumps lifted the river's water through cast-iron pipes to a reservoir on Fairmount Hill, from which it flowed by gravity through the city's distribution system. The works were housed in neoclassical buildings of considerable architectural distinction, their columned facades suggesting a Roman engineering pride translated into Pennsylvania sandstone. Yet as the century progressed and the city's population expanded, the demand for water outpaced the works' capacity, and the Schuylkill itself became increasingly contaminated by the industrial and domestic wastes of the mill towns upstream. By late century, records suggest that the quality of Philadelphia's drinking water had become a matter of serious public health concern, contributing to the persistence of typhoid fever and other waterborne diseases. The churches of Philadelphia constituted an architectural and social landscape of extraordinary richness. Christ Church on 2nd Street, with its graceful steeple rising above the surrounding rooftops, was perhaps the most famous, its congregation having included Washington, Franklin, and the signers of the Declaration. The Quaker meeting houses, by contrast, were models of deliberate plainness, their whitewashed walls, plain glass windows, and absence of ornament expressing a theology that equated simplicity with spiritual authenticity. Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Catholic, and African Methodist Episcopal congregations each erected their own buildings and maintained their own communities, creating a religious geography that both divided and unified the city's inhabitants. No account of Philadelphia County in this period could be adequate without lingering upon the Quaker inheritance that had shaped the city's institutions, its philanthropic culture, and its particular approach to civic virtue. The Religious Society of Friends had founded Pennsylvania as a holy experiment, a province where liberty of conscience would prevail and violence would yield to persuasion. By the century under examination, Quakers no longer held the political dominance they had once possessed, yet their influence upon institutions, hospitals, schools, asylums, and penitentiaries remained profound and visible in the built environment of every decade. The Pennsylvania Hospital, founded in 1751 through the combined efforts of Benjamin Franklin and Dr. Thomas Bond, stood as the oldest hospital in America. Its Pine Street premises, a substantial brick structure with a central dome, received the sick, the injured, and those suffering from mental illness. The hospital's management was long dominated by Quaker trustees whose commitment to humane treatment reflected the religious convictions that had motivated the institution's founding. Eastern State Penitentiary, opened in 1829 on the northern edge of the city near Cherry Hill, represented another expression of Philadelphia's reforming impulse. The system practiced there solitary confinement in large, well-lit cells, with each prisoner isolated from all others, was designed by its Quaker-influenced architects and reformers as a means of promoting genuine penitence rather than mere punishment. The building itself was extraordinary, a Gothic fortress whose massive stone walls and radiating cell block plan were observed and imitated by penal institutions across the Western world. The Vaux family and other Quaker reformers visited, observed, and published observations that influenced the global development of prison architecture and penal philosophy. Girard College, established by the bequest of Stephen Girard, the French-born banker and philanthropist who died in 1831, leaving one of the largest fortunes in American history, became another of the county's landmark institutions. Girard stipulated that his wealth should fund a school for poor, white, male orphans, and the institution that arose on the Fair Hill estate near the northern city was a marvel of Greek Revival architecture. Thomas U. Walter's white marble Founders Hall, surrounded by Corinthian columns in a manner that owed much to ancient Athens, stood as one of the most imposing structures in America. Humane treatment reflected the religious convictions that had motivated the institution's founding. The University of Pennsylvania, descended from the Academy and College of Philadelphia, founded with Benjamin Franklin's assistance in 1751, occupied a prominent place in the county's educational landscape. Located in West Philadelphia, in the district of Blockley Township, by the latter decades of the century, the university educated physicians, lawyers, and men of various learned professions. The Pepper family, the Biddle family, and others associated with the university's governance and benefaction contributed both financial resources and intellectual energy to its development. Libraries and learned societies gave Philadelphia County a cultural authority that no other American city could challenge through much of the century. The Library Company of Philadelphia, the oldest lending library in America, maintained extensive collections. The American Philosophical Society, founded by Franklin, continued its work of scientific inquiry and publication from its hall on Philosophical Society Row near Independence Hall. The Academy of Natural Sciences occupied its premises and maintained collections of natural history that attracted scholars from across the world. The Athenaeum of Philadelphia, with its elegant brownstone palazzo on Washington Square, provided members with reading rooms, periodicals, and an architecture collection that served the city's growing community of designers and builders. The Quaker community itself was not monolithic. Divisions, sometimes gentle, sometimes acrimonious, separated the Orthodox Friends from the Hicksites, the latter following the teachings of Elias Hicks in emphasizing the inner light over scriptural authority. This separation, which became formal in 1827, split families and meetings, and its effects were felt in the city's social and charitable institutions for generations. The Hicks family, the Evans family, and the Mott family stood on one side of this divide, while families such as the Morrises and Jenkinses maintained orthodox positions. Whatever their internal disagreements, Quakers of various persuasions contributed disproportionately to the county's reform movements. The abolition of slavery was a cause that had been championed by Philadelphia Friends from the earliest period, and the city's Quaker-founded Pennsylvania Abolition Society, established in 1775 and reorganized in 1789, was the oldest anti-slavery organization in the world. The Underground Railroad passed through Philadelphia, with Quaker households in the northern townships and German-settled communities serving as places of refuge and assistance for those fleeing bondage. The African American community of Philadelphia County was substantial and, in certain respects, remarkable. The city held the largest free black population of any major American city through much of the century, and its institutions, churches, mutual aid societies, schools, and newspapers were evidence of a community that had organized itself against formidable obstacles. The African Methodist Episcopal Church, whose founding by Richard Allen in 1794 represented a decisive assertion of religious independence, was headquartered in Philadelphia. Mother Bethel Church on South Street stood as a spiritual and civic anchor for a community that navigated daily the paradox of inhabiting the City of Liberty while facing persistent discrimination. Philadelphia earned, through the accumulated effort of its artisans, mechanics, and mill hands, a designation that its citizens wore with pride, the workshop of the world. No other American city in the century under consideration could boast so diverse a range of manufactured goods, so varied a population of skilled craftsmen, or so intricate a relationship between small workshop and large factory as Philadelphia County. The city that had been founded on principles of commerce and tolerance proved equally hospitable to the forge and the loom. Textile manufacturing was among the most significant and most geographically widespread of the county's industries. The district of Kensington, in the county's northeastern reaches, had developed during the opening decades of the century into one of the most concentrated textile producing centers in the Americas. Weavers from the north of England and Scotland brought their skills in handloom weaving and established households in which the loom occupied the front room and the shuttle flew from before dawn until the light failed at evening. The Creese family, the Watkins family, and the McAvoy family were among those whose names appeared frequently in the records of Kensington's weaving households. Manayunk, situated where the Schuylkill makes a dramatic bend near the village of Roxborough, underwent a transformation during the 1820s and 1830s that was astonishing in its speed and completeness. The construction of the Schuylkill Navigation Canal along the river's western bank created a mill district of concentrated power. Textile mills, first cotton, later wool and carpet, rose along the canal's towpath, their 5- and 6-story stone facades overlooking both canal and river. The Schuylkill Falls Cotton Manufacturing Company, the Manayunk Manufacturing Company, and other enterprises recruited workers from across the British Isles and employed them in conditions that were sometimes tolerable and sometimes not. The Griffith family, the Owen family, and the Price family, Welsh-descended settlers who had been in the Manayunk area for generations, witnessed the village of their grandparents become an industrial town within a single lifetime. Germantown, the ancient settlement on the Ridge Road to the north, maintained a dual identity throughout the century. Its domestic textile tradition, particularly the production of knitted stockings, mittens, and woolen goods in what became known generically as Germantown work, had roots reaching back to the German Protestant settlers of the 17th century. Yet by mid-century, Germantown was also becoming a fashionable suburban retreat for Philadelphia's prosperous classes. Its large houses, stable air, and remove from the city's noise and disease attracting families who maintained counting houses on Chestnut Street, but preferred to spend their evenings on Germantown Avenue. The metal trades occupied a prominent place in the county's industrial life. The Baldwin Locomotive Works, established by Matthias Baldwin in 1832 on Broad Street, produced steam locomotives of increasing size and sophistication that were sold to railroads across the country and abroad. The works grew from a small workshop to a vast complex employing hundreds and eventually thousands of workers, its products contributing materially to the transformation of American transportation. The sound of metal on metal, the roar of foundry furnaces, and the hiss of steam became characteristic features of the neighborhood that grew up around the Baldwin Works. Shipbuilding along the Delaware remained significant through mid-century, though the transition from wooden sailing vessels to iron-hulled steamships placed growing demands upon capital and technical sophistication. The Cramp Shipbuilding Company, established by William Cramp in 1838, would grow to become one of the nation's foremost naval and commercial shipbuilders by century's end. The wharves of Kensington and the Northern Liberties maintained their associations with ship construction, their workers skilled in the specialized crafts of caulking, rigging, and the working of both wood and iron. Printing and publishing were industries in which Philadelphia maintained a position of national preeminence through much of the century. The city that had been home to Franklin's Press and to Matthew Carey's publishing empire continued to produce books, periodicals, and newspapers in quantities that reached every corner of the Republic. The Saturday Evening Post, founded in 1821, was perhaps the most widely known of these publications. The Lippincott family, the Carey and Hart firm, and numerous smaller publishers and printers made the neighborhood around 4th and Chestnut a center of the American book trade. Chemical manufacturing, pharmaceutical production, and the manufacture of paints and dyes formed another layer of industrial activity, concentrated particularly in the Frankfort area and along the lower Schuylkill. The Powers and Waitman chemical works produced pharmaceuticals and industrial chemicals of various descriptions, their facilities representing an early form of the systematic, capital-intensive chemical industry that would grow enormously in the following century. The workshop and factory represented only part of the county's industrial character. Equally significant were the thousands of artisan households, the shoemakers, tailors, hatters, cabinet makers, silversmiths, and chandlers, whose workshops occupied the back rooms and ground floors of row houses throughout the city's neighborhoods. These craftsmen and their families produced goods of high quality for local and regional markets. Their skills passed from master to journeyman to apprentice in a system that had changed little in centuries. The gradual displacement of this artisan economy by factory production was one of the defining social tensions of the century's middle decades, provoking organization, protest, and the emergence of a labor movement that would persist and grow across all the decades that followed. The decade of the 1840s transformed Philadelphia County's population in ways that would have been difficult to anticipate in the quieter demographic conditions of the century's first years. The Great Famine in Ireland, which began in 1845 and drove more than 1 million people from that island in the space of a few years, sent tens of thousands of Irish Catholics to Philadelphia. They arrived in the poorest possible conditions, many nearly starving, most possessed of little more than the clothes they wore, and they settled wherever affordable housing existed, which meant primarily the crowded courts and alleys of Southwark, the Northern Liberties, and Moyamensing. The encounter between the Irish Catholic newcomers and the predominantly Protestant, often nativist population of the county was not always peaceful. The nativist riots of 1844, which erupted in Kensington and Southwark and resulted in the burning of Catholic churches and the deaths of more than 20 people, represented the most violent manifestation of this tension. The Hibernia Hose Company, a neighborhood organization in which Irish residents had taken pride, became a flashpoint in these events, and the names of those who died, Catholic and Protestant, Irish and native-born, remained present in family memories for generations. German immigration, already significant in the earlier decades of the century, intensified following the failed revolutions of 1848 in the German states. The newcomers were often educated, politically aware, and possessed of skills in trades and professions. They settled in distinct neighborhoods in the Northern Liberties in parts of Kensington and gradually in newer areas of the consolidated city, establishing their own churches, which were Lutheran, Reformed, and Catholic in roughly equal measure, as well as German-language newspapers, singing societies, and Turnverein athletic associations. The German community brought with them strong traditions of organized labor and political radicalism that influenced Philadelphia's emerging workers' movement. The Schreiber family, the Hoffman family, and the Weber family were among those whose skills in trades such as cigar making, brewing, and the leather trades contributed to both the city's economy and its evolving culture of labor organization. If you find yourself listening to these words tonight in some quiet corner of the world, perhaps far from Philadelphia's old streets, perhaps in a house whose walls know nothing of the 19th century, consider that the history we explore together is not a possession of any particular place. The families whose names these pages record, the workers who bent over their looms and anvils, the mothers who carried water from pumps and baked bread before dawn, they are the common inheritance of those who care to listen. If these quiet chronicles serve you as a companion in the hours of rest, we invite you to subscribe, to mark yourself as a reader in this ongoing ledger of American memory, so that these histories may remain preserved against the forgetting that time brings to all things. The county's established families, the Pennypacker family, the Vaux family, the Cadwallader family, observed these demographic changes with mixed sentiments. Some engaged actively with immigrant communities through charitable and settlement work, recognizing in the newcomers both the vulnerabilities of poverty and the potential contributions of industry and skill. Others withdrew to the increasingly fashionable suburbs of Germantown, Chestnut Hill, and the areas beyond the consolidated city, seeking to maintain a social distance that the city's density was rapidly making impossible. The Consolidation Act of 1854 represented an attempt by the established interests of the city to impose order upon the rapidly growing and increasingly ungovernable constellation of municipalities that comprised the county. By merging the city proper with its 29 surrounding townships, boroughs, and districts into a single governmental unit, the act created the largest city by area in America, some 129 square miles of territory under a single municipal authority. The Moyamensing and Passyunk districts, with their mixed populations and occasionally violent street politics, were absorbed into this new civic entity. The consolidation brought both benefits and disruptions. It rationalized police protection, a matter of some urgency given that intercommunal violence had been facilitated by the jurisdictional confusion between adjacent municipalities. It created a single tax base and enabled the coordination of infrastructure projects across the entire county. Yet it also dissolved the local identity and self-governance of communities that had developed their own distinct characters over generations. African American Philadelphians, whose position in the city had been complicated by both progress and reaction, found themselves in the decade before the Civil War navigating increasing hostility from newly arrived immigrants who competed for the same unskilled and semi-skilled employment. The mutual aid societies, the Free African Society, the United Sons of Africa, and others, maintained their functions of community support and solidarity against both economic competition and the legal vulnerability of any free black person in a society where the Fugitive Slave Act created constant danger of capture or kidnapping. The secession crisis of 1860 and the war that followed transformed Philadelphia County, as it did every part of the American North, yet the transformation here bore particular marks. Philadelphia was the nearest major northern city to the Confederate lines, connected to Washington by rail and to the border states by river and road. The city served simultaneously as a center of military mobilization, a hospital and convalescent center, and an industrial supplier of the Union war effort. The response to the call for volunteers was immediate and substantial. Pennsylvania provided more troops than any state but New York and Ohio, and the Philadelphia regiments, the 72nd Pennsylvania, the 71st Pennsylvania, and many others that bore the county's name or the names of its neighborhoods and communities, marched south in numbers that transformed nearly every household in some way. The Biddle family, the Cadwallader family, and the Meade family provided officers of senior rank. The weavers of Kensington and the dockworkers of the Northern Liberties provided the rank and file. The city's industrial capacity was mobilized for war production with a comprehensiveness that suggested how thoroughly the Philadelphia economy had been integrated into national networks of supply and distribution. The Baldwin Locomotive Works contracted for military engines. The textile mills of Kensington and Manayunk produced woolen cloth for uniforms by the tens of thousands of yards. The chemical establishments supplied saltpeter, sulfur, and other materials of military necessity. The shipyards produced naval vessels for the blockade fleet and for river operations. The wounded and the dying came north in numbers that overwhelmed existing medical facilities. Philadelphia responded by creating a network of military hospitals, converting public buildings, hotels, churches, and purpose-built pavilion hospitals into facilities that received the casualties of battles fought in Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. Satterley Hospital in West Philadelphia was among the largest military hospitals in the Union, its capacity eventually exceeding 4,000 patients. The nurses who staffed these institutions, many of them women who had no prior professional medical experience, worked under conditions of extremity that demanded both physical endurance and emotional resilience. The Dix family, the Sellers family, and many others not recorded in formal histories provided this care. The summer of 1863 brought the war to Philadelphia County's doorstep in a manner that no one had anticipated. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia invaded Pennsylvania and advanced to within several miles of Harrisburg before turning to engage the Union forces at Gettysburg, in Adams County, a small Pennsylvania town 3 days' march from Philadelphia's city limits. The anxiety in the county during those days of late June and early July was profound, as residents packed valuables, evacuated families, and watched the roads to the west with apprehension. The Gettysburg campaign passed, and Philadelphia was spared the fate of occupation or bombardment, yet the aftermath was felt keenly. The tens of thousands of casualties produced by those 3 days of fighting arrived in the city's hospitals in streams that continued for weeks. The Cooper Shop Volunteer Refreshment Saloon, a remarkable institution established by citizens near the Delaware wharves, served hundreds of thousands of soldiers passing through the city, providing food and medical care to men in transit that the military's own organization could not adequately supply. The war also provided African American Philadelphians with an opportunity, however fraught, to assert their citizenship through military service. The 3rd United States Colored Troops, recruited primarily in Philadelphia, were among the first African American regiments raised in the North. The Octavius V. Cato family and other prominent members of the black community organized the recruitment effort, arguing that military service would both demonstrate loyalty and strengthen claims to full civil equality in the war's aftermath. The war's end brought celebrations, but also the long labor of reconstruction for Philadelphia as for all of the North. Veterans returned from battlefields, some whole, many wounded in body or spirit. The Masons' Home for Soldiers, Widows, and Orphans, the Soldiers' Home, and various charitable organizations attended to those whose war had left them incapable of full self-support. The Grand Army of the Republic established its Department of Pennsylvania, and posts in every neighborhood provided the social and political bonds that gave veterans collective voice in the post-war city. The post-war years brought both a consolidation of industrial strength and a sharpening of the social inequalities that industrialization produced. The city's manufacturers, enriched by wartime contracts and the demands of post-war reconstruction, invested in expansion. Workers, their numbers augmented by continued immigration, and by the freed people who began moving northward in increasing numbers, found conditions of employment that reflected the power imbalance between capital and labor. The decade of the 1870s was marked by labor unrest, culminating in the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, which reached Philadelphia and produced confrontations between workers and militia that left both property damaged and community relations strained. In 1867, the city of Philadelphia undertook an act of civic foresight that would shape the county's character for all the decades remaining in the century and far beyond. The creation of Fairmount Park, achieved by the gradual acquisition of private estates along both banks of the Schuylkill above the Fairmount Water Works, assembled one of the largest urban parks in the world, an expanse of several thousand acres of woodland, meadow, and river valley that was preserved from development for the use and enjoyment of the city's inhabitants. The decision to create the park was motivated partly by aesthetic and recreational considerations, and partly by the practical recognition that the Schuylkill River, Philadelphia's principal drinking water source, required protection from the industrial and residential development that was relentlessly advancing along its banks. The estates that were acquired in the process, Lemon Hill, Sedgley, Woodford, Strawberry Mansion, and others, were themselves remarkable relics of the county's earlier agricultural and residential history. The Centennial Exposition of 1876 brought the world to Philadelphia County in a manner that had no precedent in American history. Conceived as a celebration of the nation's 100th birthday, the Centennial occupied 236 acres of Fairmount Park, with some 250 buildings, the main exhibition hall among them being the largest building in the world at the time of its construction. More than 10 million visitors came from every state and from nations around the globe, experiencing for many the first view of the technologies, the coreless steam engine, the telephone demonstrated by Alexander Graham Bell, the typewriter, the electric arc lamp, that would shape the century to come. The Japanese pavilion, the British exhibits, the spectacular machinery hall, where the enormous coreless engine turned its enormous flywheel in near silence. These were spectacles that visitors described with a wonder that even the most restrained prose could not entirely contain. The Lowell family, the Drexel family, and the Childs family were among those Philadelphia patrons whose financial and organizational contributions made the Centennial possible. Boathouse Row, the succession of Victorian boathouses built along the east bank of the Schuylkill below the park, represented another dimension of the county's leisure culture. The rowing clubs, the Undine Barge Club, the Vesper Boat Club, the Philadelphia Rowing Club, and others, provided athletic recreation and social identity for their members. Their annual regattas drew large crowds to the banks of the Schuylkill, turning the river temporarily into a festival of competition and display. The Drexel family and the Biddle family were among those who participated in and patronized this distinctly Philadelphia tradition. Baseball emerged as the great popular recreation of the post-war decades. The Philadelphia Athletics, established in 1860, competed against other city clubs and eventually against teams from New York, Boston, and Cincinnati. The game was played on grounds in various parts of the city, drawing crowds of working men who followed the fortunes of their favored clubs with passionate attention. The sport provided one of the few arenas where men of different ethnic and class backgrounds shared a common enthusiasm, if not always a common experience. The theaters, concert halls, and musical venues of Philadelphia County offered cultural pleasures to a broad range of inhabitants. The Academy of Music, opened in 1857 on Broad Street, was designed to become, and did become, the premier opera and concert venue in the Americas. Its Horseshoe Auditorium, modeled on La Scala in Milan, and its acoustics celebrated by musicians and audiences alike. The Germania Orchestra, composed primarily of German immigrant musicians, performed in various venues, and the musical traditions brought by successive waves of German immigration infused the city's musical culture with both technical sophistication and democratic enthusiasm. Theater was democratic in a somewhat different sense. The pit was cheap and vociferous, the boxes expensive and refined, and the mixture produced an audience that could not be found in any single social stratum but represented, in its noisy, opinionated, enthusiastic totality, something genuinely civic. The Walnut Street Theater, the Chestnut Street Theater, and the Arch Street Theater offered drama, comedy, melodrama, and entertainment of every description throughout the century, their stages graced by the great performers of the era. The parks, theaters, and public spaces of Philadelphia County served as stages upon which the city's social relations were performed and negotiated. The question of who was welcome where, which was to say, the question of race, class, and nativity, played out in the details of admission, seating, and service at every venue. The county was a place of both extraordinary civic aspiration and persistent social exclusion, and the history of its leisure institutions cannot be separated from the history of those exclusions. Within the houses of Philadelphia County, in the brick row houses of the working neighborhoods, in the substantial townhouses of the commercial middle class, in the country houses of the wealthy, and in the crowded tenements of the newest arrivals, life proceeded according to rhythms that were universal in their broad outlines and infinitely varied in their particular details. The household of a Philadelphia artisan or tradesman in the middle decades of the century occupied typically a 2- or 3-story brick row house, 1 room deep and perhaps 20 feet wide, its rooms arranged vertically on the narrow lot. The ground floor contained the parlor, a room maintained for company and formal occasions, its furniture covered against dust when not in use, and behind it the kitchen or keeping room, where the actual domestic life of the family was conducted. The kitchen stove, cast iron and heavy, sat against the wall adjacent to the chimney, its heat supplemented in cold months by the fireplace that the stove had not entirely displaced in older houses. Cooking was a labor whose requirements expanded with the size and pretension of the household. In modest households, a wife managed all the cooking herself, with the occasional assistance of daughters. In more prosperous establishments, a domestic servant, almost always a woman, frequently Irish-born, performed the heavy kitchen work under the direction of the mistress of the house. The market supplied fresh produce, and the variety of foods available in Philadelphia was remarkable by the standards of other American cities. Oysters from the Delaware and Chesapeake, shad running in the Schuylkill in spring, soft shell crabs in summer, terrapin in autumn, game from the fields of New Jersey across the Delaware. The Biddle family's cook, renowned among the households of Chestnut Hill for her terrapin stew, worked in a kitchen equipped with copper pots, a roasting jack, and the range of tools that a prosperous household could furnish. The Laper family's kitchen, connected to the main house by a covered passage to keep kitchen smells and heat at a remove, produced daily meals whose procurement alone required a morning's attention to the markets. Children's lives in Philadelphia County varied dramatically according to class and circumstance. In prosperous families, children attended private academies or, after mid-century, the improving public schools, their education oriented toward either commercial or cultural attainments. In working families, children contributed to household income from an early age, running errands, assisting in workshops, selling newspapers on street corners, or in the textile districts, working alongside parents at frames and looms. The agitation to restrict child labor gathered strength through the century, but achieved only limited legislative success before the century's close. The grammar schools and high schools established by the public school system, the Central High School for boys being perhaps the most celebrated, its curriculum rivaling that of many colleges, provided pathways of advancement for the children of modest families that earlier generations could not have accessed. The McCloskey family, the Doyle family, and the Hanson family were among those whose sons passed through Central High School to careers in law, medicine, and commerce that represented genuine social mobility. The rhythms of the week were marked by the Sabbath, which Philadelphia maintained with more stringency than many cities, reflecting its Quaker and Presbyterian inheritances. Businesses were expected to close, and the particular quiet of a Philadelphia Sunday, the stilled commerce, the churches opened, the market stands empty, was noted by visitors who compared it to other American and European cities. The evening quiet extended through the working week in the respectable neighborhoods, where the after-dark streets were left largely to those whose businesses or necessities required nocturnal movement. Illness remained an intimate companion of the household. Cholera visited the city in epidemic waves in 1832, 1849, and 1866. Each outbreak claiming thousands of lives and demonstrating the inadequacy of the water supply and sewage systems. Tuberculosis, then called consumption, was the great slow killer, its progress measured in months and years, and it appeared in virtually every social class and neighborhood. The gradual adoption of public health measures, inspection of food and water supplies, quarantine of infectious cases, vaccination against smallpox, represented a halting progress toward the understanding that disease was not a divine visitation, but a consequence of environmental and biological conditions that human action could alter. The evening after the day's labor concluded and the household had settled was the time for reading, for music, for conversation, and for the particular pleasures of domestic quietness. Newspapers were read aloud in many households. Musical instruments, pianos in prosperous homes, fiddles and accordions in more modest ones, provided entertainment that no commercial establishment could duplicate. The gas lamp and eventually the electric lamp extended the useful hours of evening into territory that had previously belonged entirely to darkness, allowing the reading and writing and needlework to continue long after the light had otherwise failed. In the final decades of the century, Philadelphia County was transformed by forces that gathered speed even as they appeared, from close observation, merely as the continuation of patterns long established. Population growth continued at a pace that filled the newly consolidated city's formerly empty acreages with row houses, industrial facilities, and commercial establishments. The horse-drawn streetcar system, which had begun operating in the 1850s, was converted to electric operation in the 1890s, and the extended reach of the streetcar lines pushed residential development outward into what had been farmland and market gardens. The row house was the characteristic building type of this expansion. Constructed by speculative builders in long, unbroken ranks, these 2.5-story brick dwellings offered modest but genuine comfort, running water from the public system, gas or electric light, indoor privies and eventually water closets, at rents or purchase prices that a skilled worker could manage. The Brewery Town neighborhood, Fishtown, West Philadelphia, and the areas of the far northeast all developed during these years, their populations arriving in successive waves and shaping the neighborhood character that would persist for generations. Reform movements proliferated in these decades, each addressing one of the many social problems that urban industrial growth had created or exacerbated. The temperance cause, long associated with evangelical Protestantism and Quaker social concern, gained new energy and political sophistication. Settlement houses, modeled on Jane Addams's Hull House in Chicago, were established in the poorer neighborhoods, their middle-class workers living among the poor they sought to assist with education, childcare, employment services, and civic engagement. Women's public roles expanded, though within continuing constraints. The Woman's Medical College of Pennsylvania, established in 1850, trained women as physicians when no other medical school would admit them. The Biddle family and others had supported this institution financially, and the women it produced, among them Dr. Ann Preston and Dr. Hannah Longshore, practiced medicine in the county and trained subsequent generations. Women's clubs, literary societies, and settlement organizations created spheres of organized female action that prepared the ground for the suffrage campaigns of the coming century. Immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe began in significant numbers during the 1880s and intensified in the following decade. Italians settled in South Philadelphia, establishing dense communities around the Italian market on 9th Street and the Catholic parishes that anchored their religious and social life. Eastern European Jews, fleeing persecution in the Russian Empire and the successor states of Central Europe, formed communities in the Northern Liberties and in South Philadelphia. Their synagogues, charitable societies, and small businesses creating an urban landscape of extraordinary ethnic vitality. The encounter between these newest arrivals and the earlier inhabitants, Irish, German, African American, and the old stock Protestant families, produced the complex, layered social geography that characterized Philadelphia County at century's end. The neighborhood was the fundamental unit of social belonging, its boundaries defined not by law but by the invisible but potent markers of religion, language, and origin that made each block and each intersection a place with a specific and negotiated character. The political life of the county in the later decades was dominated by the Republican machine, the organization built by James McMains, the king of Tammany Hall's Philadelphia equivalent, whose control of the city's patronage and electoral processes was remarkable in its thoroughness. The machine delivered services and employment to its constituents, particularly among the immigrant populations who needed both and were willing to provide reliable votes in return. Reform-minded citizens, organized in the Committee of 100 and similar bodies, challenged machine control periodically and sometimes successfully, yet the machine's capacity for adaptation and resilience made sustained reform difficult. The great institutions of the final decades, Drexel Institute of Art, Science, and Industry, founded by Anthony Drexel in 1891, the relocated and expanded University of Pennsylvania in West Philadelphia, the Pennsylvania Museum and School of Industrial Art, represented investments in education and culture that reflected both private philanthropy and civic aspiration. The Drexel family, the Biddle family, and the Pepper family contributed fortunes built in banking, commerce, and law to these and other institutions, seeking to give permanent form to values of enlightenment and improvement. Public transportation became the organizing principle of the late-century city. The horse-car lines of the 1860s and 70s were converted to electric operation beginning in 1892, and the resulting speed and range of transit reshaped where people lived in relation to where they worked. The long rows of new brick houses filling West Philadelphia, Germantown, and Frankfort were products of this transportation revolution, their inhabitants able to reach the commercial center in 20 minutes rather than an hour. To consider Philadelphia County at century's end is to stand before an inheritance of extraordinary and somewhat bewildering complexity. The county had entered the century as the largest and most consequential urban center in the American Republic, heir to a colonial and revolutionary legacy that no other American city could match. It concluded the century as the third largest city in the nation, having been surpassed by New York in the earlier decades and by Chicago in the final ones, yet in no sense diminished, merely repositioned within a national hierarchy that had grown to accommodate the ambitions of a continent. The physical city at century's close was a place of extraordinary contrasts. The great public buildings, the new city hall under construction for much of the latter half of the century, its French Second Empire Tower eventually rising to the height of the Pyramid of Cheops, asserted civic grandeur on a scale that few cities anywhere could approach. The Academy of Music, the University of Pennsylvania's new campus, the museums and libraries, the parks, these represented aspirations toward permanence and cultivation that were genuinely achieved. Yet adjacent to these monuments of civic aspiration were neighborhoods of severe poverty, their courts and alleys little improved from those that had housed the poor at the century's beginning. The persistence of poverty amid extraordinary wealth was not unique to Philadelphia, yet it struck visitors and reformers with particular force in a city that had made civic virtue and philanthropic responsibility central to its self-understanding. The disconnect between the rhetoric of the Republic's birthplace and the realities of its working-class districts was a source of ongoing moral discomfort. The Quaker reformers, the settlement house workers, the labor organizers, and the journalists who documented these conditions were engaged in a common effort, though they differed considerably in their analyses and prescriptions. The Bradford family, the Vaux family, and others maintained the tradition of engaged philanthropy that had characterized Philadelphia's Quaker inheritance. The Powderly family and others associated with the labor movement argued that structural change in the terms of employment was necessary to make reform sustainable. The memory of the founding era cast a particular quality of light over the entire century. The buildings associated with the Revolution, Independence Hall, Carpenter's Hall, the First and Second Banks of the United States, were objects of civic veneration, visited by pilgrims from every state and every nation who came to stand where Washington had stood, where Franklin had argued, where the Declaration had been signed. The preservation of these structures was not taken for granted. Proposals to demolish them for commercial development arose and were defeated throughout the century, each defeat representing a collective decision to honor the weight of the past over the claims of the present. The newspapers of the city, the Public Ledger, the Inquirer, the Press, the Record, and others, documented the century's life in columns of close-set type that ran continuously from the inauguration of their publication to the century's end, creating archives of extraordinary density and value. The families who built and maintained these enterprises, the Drexels, the Chilices, the Leys, understood journalism as both commercial enterprise and civic obligation, a view that shaped the tone and content of Philadelphia's press in ways that distinguished it from the sensational styles of New York. The century's most ordinary lives, the lives that filled no newspaper column, won no public honor, and left no signature in any formal record, were the lives that composed the actual texture of Philadelphia County's history. The woman who worked a hand loom in Kensington for 40 years and raised 5 children in a 2-room house, and attended St. Michael's Church, and buried 2 of those children, and lived to see the others established in trades of their own. The German-born baker whose shop on Girard Avenue supplied bread to 3 generations of the same block. The free black laborer who loaded coal at the Schuylkill wharves and maintained his membership in Mother Bethel through all the decades of his working life. These lives were the substance of history, and if they are less easily recovered than the lives of the famous, they are not for that reason less real or less worthy of remembrance. Philadelphia County closed the century as it had entered it, a place of extraordinary complexity and historical weight, its streets layered with the evidence of every decade of American history, its population drawn from every nation, its institutions ranging from the most venerable in the Republic to the most recently established, its social life simultaneously aspiring to civic virtue and constrained by the human failures that no civic virtue, however sincere, had yet managed to overcome. The Delaware still moved through its tidal course along the eastern edge, bearing the commerce of the world as it had borne it when Penn first looked upon this ground and imagined a city of brotherly love. And thus we close the entry for Philadelphia County. Rest well.